the streets, being in the street life. These are popular phrases you hear people refer to, but what does that really mean, and does it even really still go on? And it's interesting. I read so many books and study the history of crime in America, and of course, especially in Black America, and the intersection of organized crime with what was going on in Black neighborhoods. And the history of it starts a lot earlier than you might think. By the early 70s, the Kingpin era, Superfly era, all that stuff was already old. It was 50 years old then. Pimping, selling drugs, doing drugs, being outside in the street, doing cons and hustles in the city. That had been going on extensively for 50 years already in the 70s. And then if you look at what was going on in, poor white urban areas, I mean, it goes back into the 1890s. I mean, there was a gang in Manhattan called the Gophers in, like say before, maybe right around the time of World War I. So 1912, 1910. Their thing was, if a cop walked through their neighborhood, to beat them up, or they would get high on yayo, and if a cop walked through their neighborhood, they would beat him up, take his uniform, and walk around the neighborhood in the cop's uniform high on yayo. This is 1910. These are teenage white gang members in Manhattan. So, that sounds wilder than most things that go on now. But relevant to our discussion of the street life in Black America, well, why did it become so widespread, and why is it still holding on, this idea that you got to go out in the street and you're going to figure it out, or which I think has come to an end because of the cell phone and because of COVID. I mean, I don't know really if that whole being outside and doing stuff, but I guess the streets have moved to the internet to some degree, but it's not the same thing. But Black males especially were never really fully integrated into the U.S. economy, so there were a lot of excess labor units coming to the cities of the Midwest and the North, New York and Chicago first of all. Chicago had a huge Black underground economy by the late 1920s, and in fact, if in the normal sort of life cycle of ethnic groups in America using crime to get ahead, Black Americans were ahead of the Italians. They were kind of in step with the Jews. Like there was very rich Black criminals in the numbers game in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, that if it wasn't for A, generalized racism made it harder for them to move into the mainstream, but B, the Italian Mafia after World War II, well, in New York they did it in the 30s with Dutch Schultz going after Madame St. Clair and the numbers, taking over the numbers. And they did it in Chicago. It took them longer in Chicago. They took to after the war and into maybe the late 50s. In Detroit, it kind of was a joint effort with the Italians and the Black gangsters. But by violence in New York and Chicago, the Italians took the numbers from the Black numbers operators, the policy operators, at the very peak of its time. The Jones brothers in Chicago they owned several of the the biggest policy wheels in Chicago. So what was a policy wheel? It was a like I think it was like a tumbler, almost like a bingo thing. And a number would be pulled. And pretty ingenious operation, because it was sort of like a multi-level marketing for criminal ventures. I mean, because even though the numbers has become one of the big sources of income for state and local governments now, but it was a crime then. And if you wanted to become a numbers man, you could, if you got yourself some clients who would bet with you, and you got a relationship with someone, the bank, someone behind you, then you could, if you worked at some factory, big factory, and you had 200 people there playing the numbers with you, and you got yourself attached to one of these policy banks like the Jones Brothers, you turned in all the money, and they would back you if there was a big loss, and it was all based on closer to like a real business. It's not like selling drugs. There's not nearly as big of a profit margin, but it's a guaranteed profit. You just have to watch every penny, and people liked the numbers still exist in Detroit, I'm sure in Chicago as well, probably in New York too, because they're not as big as they were, but even 15 years ago they were huge. I'm not exactly sure what goes on now, but you can get credit if you're playing the street numbers and just pay off at the end of the week. You don't have to pay tax, right? So if you hit the 3-digit state of Michigan, they're gonna take out whatever 20% tax. Streets don't take a tax out, and street number pays 600 to 1 instead of 500 to 1, so it's a better payoff. So it's much better for the gambler. And these were huge operations. I know this isn't per se a specific story about anything. This is just some research background for those of you that's interested in this. So I'm giving you kind of an overview of what was going on in different cities at different times in the street life, underground economy of Black America, because it's fascinating, especially when I realized I was watching the Iceberg Slim documentary, which you should watch. It's on Amazon, Netflix. If you didn't know what years he was writing about his adventures of pimping and robbing and stealing and shooting up and getting high, I was lost in a blizzard of cocaine. I mean, you could think it was the 80s, the 90s, the 70s, but it was the 30s, the 40s he was doing this stuff. And it had already been going on before him. How big was the numbers racket? Well, in Detroit, as late as 2005 or something, my friend's grandfather, he raided his house and got it. He had a couple million in cash, and they had to give it back. I'm not going to say his name, but he's alleged to have been a big numbers guy, all from the 60s, 70s. The owner of the record label Golden Voice Records? No, did I make up Golden Voice for a movie I wrote? Well, the would-be rival to Motown in Detroit before Motown really took off was owned by a guy named Eddie Wingate. Eddie Wingate, big numbers man. Eddie Wingate owned the 20 Grand Motel on West Grand Boulevard where, is that on West Warren? West Grand Boulevard, where all the black big acts would play. I mean, that's where many of the Motown acts got their start performing before Motown went national. And the Gotham Hotel in Detroit's Paradise Valley, which during segregation times was one of the nicest hotels in the country, and all the black elite, when they were passing through Detroit, that's where they stayed at. But once segregation ended, You didn't have the need for those. So what happened to the Gotham Hotel? It turned into, that's why I say in Detroit there became, with the black and Italians and the numbers, there became more of an alliance of some of them, because you could have your own bank. In 1963, maybe, they raided the Gotham Hotel, and it had been turned into, this is like something out of a movie. The whole hotel had been turned into the operational center of the numbers business emanating out of Detroit, which probably stretched from Flint through all of Metro Detroit and down into northern Ohio until Cleveland probably had, or Cleveland, I'm sure, had its own system, but Detroit's took in Toledo's, I'm sure. So I think the receipts, the estimated yearly gross amount bet, and this is in 1963, it's like $250 million. They had hundreds of numbers runners turning in money every day. They had banks and banks and banks of phone operators where I guess I don't really know how it worked. I guess you could call in, if you were a runner, you could just call in and turn in all what your bets were verbally, and then you would be paid out, or you would have to turn money in when you collected it. And that's where the debt collectors would meet up there and be sent out to collect debts, and all kind of stuff. And in Chicago, going back to the Jones brothers were, quick aside, let's go to the East Coast real quick. 1929, a federal law enforcement document where they're interviewing a made member of the Philadelphia family, or were they interviewing him? What the hell was this study? Whatever the circumstance was, a made member of the Philadelphia Mafia, when he wanted to set up his numbers bank in northern New Jersey there, he wanted to set up his numbers operation. Who he went to for the bank was a black guy. So you had an Italian going to a black numbers operator to back him. The black guy was the guy with the money. This is in 1929. So there had been a lot of wealth accumulated even by then in black America that the Italians didn't have, even after Prohibition. I mean, some of the Italians had it, but the Italians didn't dominate Prohibition. Like now we think of organized crime in America just as, the Italian Mafia. It became that probably really after World War II. In the up, and even when the Kefauver Commission did its organized crime hearings in the 50s, it was called the National Crime Syndicate. There was a lot of non-Italians that were very powerful. Regular white people, like the biggest bootlegger, probably the guy who made the most money during Prohibition. Well, Joe Kennedy was one, Irish. You had Remus out of St. Louis, or can't say it's St. Louis area. No. Like, what big city? Northern Ohio, or Southern Ohio, Northern Kentucky, like near Louisville. He was the biggest bootlegger along with Joe Kennedy. Al Capone was one too, but there was others, they all weren't Italian. And even the story of Al Capone's rise is him knocking off non-Italians to take over. And he brought in members of Detroit's Jewish Purple Gang to help him with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which cemented him as the most powerful person in organized crime in Chicago. So the National Crime Syndicate, the Italians were simply one group at that time, and they continued to increase their power as the general economy got bigger and bigger. Regular white people were engaging in crime probably less, or they moved into a different kind of crime, being politicians and running corporations where you're not technically a criminal, but you're doing the same type of antisocial things. Sometimes, not all politicians or all corporations are antisocial, but certainly many are sometimes, and some are all the time. Okay, so we had the Italian guy seeking the backing of a black guy in the 20s in the Philadelphia, northern New Jersey area, and then back to Chicago, the Jones brothers. So in the, I don't know, somewhere the late 40s maybe, one of the Jones brothers gets a couple-year prison term for, his gambling operation. So he's in jail with Sam Giancana, future boss of the Chicago family. And the way that Sam Giancana really moved up the ranks in the Chicago family was that he made friends with whichever one of the Jones brothers he was locked up with. And from being his friend in jail and talking, the Jones brother made a mistake of trusting this Italian gangster and told him all the business about how much money they were making and etc. Said, oh, you can, again, the black guy extending to the Italian, oh, you could come work with us and I'll back you, because the Jones brothers already had the money. But instead, the Chicago outfit, the Italians, because they were looking for it, they needed a replacement. Prohibition had been everybody's gold rush, and when that went away, they were back to scuffling whatever they could do. There was a little drugs going on. There was a little of this. Prostitution was big. The whites and the Italians were big into pimping. Lucky Luciano went to prison for white slavery, 46 years, for running a huge brothel system, being New York's biggest pimp. So they were doing all kind of stuff. But when Sam Giancana found out how much the black policy guys were making in Detroit, him and the outfit put the play down. They started violence, and the Jones brothers ended up fleeing Chicago and just left their policy wheels to the Italians. They had so much money. They had tens of millions of dollars stashed in Mexico. This is in the 50s. They may have been, these things can't be calculated, especially that long ago. Who's the richest, this or that in the country. The Jones brothers had to be, I don't know who would have been richer. And maybe there was some other, maybe some New York numbers person, Casper Holstein, maybe one or two of the southern black families that had those early black banks. I don't know. But the Jones brothers, if they weren't the richest black people in the country, they were in the top 5. They just fled the country because they had so much overseas holdings and money and let the Italians have it. There was one black numbers guy left, Tough Teddy Rowe, who, a lot of these black numbers guys, though, now this is another topic of America's color-based caste system, where referring to, just saying, quote-unquote, black people is missing the understanding of colorism, in that there really was like a mulatto kind of class that a lot of the early black elites came out of, though not all, but even in the criminal world. So if you see like Tough Teddy Rowe or the Jones brothers in black and white photos, you damn near have to know that they're black to know that they're black, because they, of course, I have one black grandparent and I can comb my hair, but so you don't really know what racial group people are unless you know. But anyways, certainly the Jones brothers and Tough Teddy Rowe came out of the black South Side, and that's where their customer base was, and that's where they owned their businesses, and that's where they had black politicians to protect them at, and etc. So there's multiple academic books on these subjects. Black Metropolis, and these are books by black scholars, universities. Black Metropolis is one you can read if you're interested. The biographies of Iceberg Slim are good. Give you an understanding what's going on at it. Some overview. you realize how much of this street life stuff we think of is not going to the after hours and being out at night with hoes and drugs, and we're gonna trick this one and that one, and it's just less drugs, but the drugs was always there. Drugs became the dominant way to make money in the streets in the 70s, and then of course in the 80s, and now we're just kind of left with this comic book version of what the streets are supposed to be via, I guess, rap and these TV shows, these TV shows where they take a real criminal thing, BMF, whatever, and use it to get your attention, and then they, maybe the first season is based in reality, and then they just, I haven't watched the BMF of the more recent seasons. I predicted when they made it, I said by the end it'll turn into empire of gangsters. I know that they have those lesbian characters and all, which, what does that have to do with BMF? But anyways, it's a separate topic. But so the Italians took over everything by force. They had done it in New York in the 30s. They did it in Chicago, and that drained. I mean, there were still black people getting money in the numbers, but probably the chance for a big accumulation of capital and to help Black America springboard up the economic ladder, some of that opportunity was snatched away by the predatory Italians. Italian Mafia, very, very predatory. They lie with you, make you think they're your friends, and if you're not in their family, you're just another outsider, and they're gonna eventually take it by force. And there was, once they put that system in place where they were allied over different cities and they had all the political protection and muscle and all the police corruption. So then also, of course, they're involved in, well, let's also go back a little bit. Let's go back again to, I said, by the early 70s, the street life was already 50 years old in Black America. So what does that mean? What do I mean statistically? So if you look at arrest records of women for prostitution in Detroit and Chicago in the early 30s, 75-80% of the women arrested for prostitution black. Now, could that mean that the white prostitutes were more protected by law enforcement? I'm sure there's a degree of that, but remember at these times, these cities, Detroit in 1930 was maybe 10 or 15% black, Chicago probably 15%, 20%. So even if it's a little out of whack because the white prostitutes weren't getting arrested as much by ratio, still you could see that a lot more black women were pushed by economic circumstances into that world. And the white pimp system was more of a brothel, industrial scale pimping, right? Where, I have an apartment building and there's all these prostitutes associated. They just are in there and customers show up and we let all the bellhops at the hotels and all these people know that here's a brothel, anybody asks, and there's set prices and the girls keep whatever, instead of taking all the money and then you have to take care of the girl, just she lays in the room, the trick comes, is $30, the room gets half, she gets half, or whatever the setup was. They're doing industrial scale pimping, whereas again, due to lack of access to capital and structural organization and political power, the black criminal, the black pimp is operating on a more, for the most part, on a smaller sort of individual scale, so it becomes this personalized psychological tango of death between the pimp and the hoe, each trying to extract the most out of the other before the other is worn out by the life, which is what happened to Iceberg Slim. And he hung on longer than most. You should really watch the documentary, read the Iceberg Slim biographies. I'm sure we've all read the book, but when you realize how long a lot of these, people been getting killed for gym shoes in Detroit since the mid-70s. Like, a lot of things people think started in the 80s or the 90s. It might have been new to your city, but New York, Chicago, Detroit, Philly, Cleveland. If I left your city out, don't feel bad. I mean, I don't know everywhere where everything happened at what time, but things that you might think are relatively recent have been going on, might have been going on for 100 years in some places. So the black numbers people were not the only criminals. So the mainstream whites, like I said, were moving into corporate and politics, which offered different opportunities for being shady. But other ethnic groups that had been part of the so-called National Crime Syndicate, which there was no organized National Crime Syndicate, but there in effect was a system in every city of different ethnic groups working together, and organized crime was very organized. Unlike what it became later, where people robbing were probably just dope fiends trying to get money. Someone sticking up a bar in 1955 Chicago was more likely to be connected to some organized robbery ring that made a payoff to somebody and could get a little bit of protection if need be. So there was less crime generally in America, well, or at least less reported, which is another story. But so, interesting story. When I met one of my good friends some years ago, he's half Greek, and his grandfather's all Greek. And his grandfather at the time I met him was getting old and was at that stage of kind of could hold a conversation for a minute, but not really. But some things you might say would perk up. And he introduced me to his grandfather. We were having lunch. And me and Scott Bernstein had just put out our documentary, Detroit Mob Confidential, about the Detroit Mafia. And Gustin Dromolis. And my friend, so there's a chapter in there where we talk about the Italians in Detroit taking over the Greek gambling from this neighborhood called Greektown, which is right next to Black Bottom, which was the old first black neighborhood in Detroit. And then you got Greektown, and then you had downtown. And my friend's grandfather perked up when he said Gustin Dromolis. How do you know that name? So Gustin Dromolis was the name of the Greek head he was like the boss of the Greek gambling, or he was the last of the Greek gamblers that did well. There was one in the 70s, but that's another story. He was the last of the Greek gamblers there in 1947 that didn't want to at least partner with the Italians. So he was found strangled to death in the trunk of his car. Well, that had been my friend's grandfather's boss. He was working for him and the numbers in Greektown, and that him getting strangled to death made him quit and go straight. And guess who, well, no one was convicted of this, but guess who the FBI always says strangled Gustin Dromolis to death? I mean, it was the Italians, but specifically who? And this shows you how dark that Italian mafia stuff is. The two sons of the two founders of the Detroit Mafia, they both are college graduates. They graduated college because they grew up affluent because their dads were the mob bosses. They came back in the 40s and they said, well, we want to get, you have a choice. You don't have to be in a family business, but if you get in a family business, you're subject, you don't get a pass on making your bones. So the FBI always thought that Gustin Dromolis was kidnapped, and in front of the hierarchy of the Detroit Mafia family, that the two sons took turns strangling him to death in front of their fathers and others, which is, it's like something out of a horror movie. like a supernatural horror movie. That sounds the worst thing I ever heard. So this is the underpinning of the street life of being outside and making money. Well, there's somebody always higher up the food chain. The guy at the corner store with the, or even, the guy in your neighborhood with the nickel bags of weed. Well, I guess weed's legal now too. We've had the vicification. So many things that were the lifeblood of organized crime. Did you know that up through until the American homegrown reefer industry got really cooking in, I don't know, say by 2008 or whenever it was, 2010. In the early 2000s, 2005 still, over half of Sinaloa cartel's profits were from marijuana. San Luis, Detroit, Michigan. Between January 1st and February 20th or something of like 2004, like 45 days, he received like 20,000 pounds of marijuana in 40 days. San Luis organization was bigger than BMF just selling weed. In Detroit and maybe Georgia and a couple places, but mainly Detroit, it would get 4,000 pound loads every week, 2 a week sometimes, doubling their money. And now, weed is legal. San Luis, meantime, did about 15 years he's been out. Featured on America's Gangsters Most Evil. But the thing that he was doing that was so evil is now legal. Of course, we know gambling, as we were talking about the numbers that became not just legal, but in Michigan, they so-called use it to fund the education fund comes from tax on state lottery revenue. Wow. Now you have these multi-state Powerballs. Now you can gamble on your phone. I was going to pick up my phone. I'm talking into my phone. You can gamble on your phone, which is probably going to be one of the most destructive things ever. So I could go on and on. I don't know how interested you are in this, but yeah, some of the stuff I'm studying about back in the past of the street life. So maybe this is interesting. Part 2 we'll discuss, or I'll ramble on about how the 1920s, 30s, and 40s of gambling and pimping and prostitution and a little bit of drugs set the stage so that in the late 60s, early 70s, as the amount of industrial jobs were declining and the amount of drug use was going up, you already had this pool of the black community. Oh, that was the last thing I wanted to tell you. That's what I was before I got sidetracked. Why did the black areas specifically, or why did the street life really take root in these black neighborhoods specifically? Well, a lot of it was due to political decision making. When you had a lot of slum clearance and stuff after World War I, and the old white slums were cleared and the vice districts were closed, vice didn't go away. They moved it over to the black neighborhoods. So that's part of the reason why I see so many black women arrested for prostitution, black men in pimping. That's where the drugs are being dealt, because the vice districts were legislated into the black neighborhoods for the most part, which corresponded also, and then there's less job opportunities for blacks, so it went together like a hand and glove. You need some money and you grow up in a red light district, all you got to do is step outside, and the street life is right there to greet you. Part 2, if you're good. Out Profit America Dope.